How's it going? All good. I assume you cannot see me. Turn on camera. Let's see if this does the trick. I don't really do video calls very often. There, I do.
Shut up and take my money.
Data discussion time.
I have a thing for some reason. Discord makes my cursor move really slowly right now. So if you see my frame rate, the frame rate on my camera drop or something, is that I have some. Yeah.
Shut up and take my money. Shut up and take my money.
Oh, actually, no, this one, I do have Helminth, but this camera is actually hooked up to just a capture card that's inside, so I would have to use a PCI slot.
Okay, I am unmuted now. Turning music stuff down. All right, hello everybody. Welcome. I have to make some adjustments to Pablo's camera, but it looks very nice.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if they can hear me now, but
should be able to.
Hello to all.
And then chat, let me know how everything sounds in terms of Pablo being loud enough and everything else.
How are my levels? 1, 2, 1, 2.
It sounds good to me.
You sound good to me, but I think I saw someone complaining about the quietness, but that's a classic with audio, you never know.
Oh yeah, it's always are they muted on their end, or does it not sound good? Right.
Then you gotta question yourself if they're trolling you.
Oh yeah, no, that's always the main issue, is like, you're lying to me though. All right, so how are you doing? What prompted what prompted the dump of the datas today?
There's some days that when I stop to see, I mean, that particular stat of Wukong, it's been there for months, and
right.
We've seen it for months. Literally the dot almost doesn't move. It's just the position of the dots. They don't move a lot across time. They move if you change certain search patterns or whatever. But so it was there, and I just tweeted it, and once everyone guessed immediately who it was, it just kind of cascaded a little bit from there. Initially, I was just gonna tweet that first one, and that's gonna be that. But once everyone started guessing, it just kind of got the ball rolling.
Oh, fair. It was it's really interesting. It's interesting to hear that the dots don't move very often. Even with new updates that bring new content, they tend not to shift very much.
They don't shift a lot. In fact, so the way that particular graph, and we don't use just that one, we have other graphs, and even that, literally to where that graph is, I have another one next to it that I use more than this one, and then there's other graphs about, there's a whole bunch of things that we look at, but that particular one, since it's breadth versus depth, which is basically how many players use a given frame, that would be the breadth, how widely used it is, and then the depth is of those players that use it, how much do they use it, right? So those are the two different things that we're measuring there. So in the case of that one, it does stay pretty stable, and when new frames come out, even after a while, they tend to stay on the low side of the breadth. So basically, when they just came out, a lot of people start using it, and then they always go down. And if you look at the left side of that graph, most of the new frames, a lot of them are there essentially, because they're people will be used to whatever their comfort picks are, and then generally, new frame comes out, they'll play it for a few weeks, and then back to even I do that. I'll
back to Old Faithful.
New frame comes out, I'll play for a while, and then let's bring back Nesha again, and let's just get back to where we belong.
Yeah, and then there's also always if people just literally have not had the time to acquire them for certain frames, because not every frame is well, just go to the clan and pick up Zephyr, right?
Yeah, and for that, I mean, there's also with stats, you're always doing a little bit of like interpretation of what does it mean, because it's not like the numbers themselves kind of tell the whole story. You have to sort of give them a little bit of interpretation. So a classic one that we use as a stand-in for actual choice versus lack of accessibility is that same graph, but only look at players MR25 and above.
Right.
Because they have everything, right? So for them, it's not a matter of I'm going to use this or that because I have it. It's a matter of what do I want to use, right? They have everything.
Like the arsenal is there. It's just what are they actually choosing?
Yeah. So when we filter like that, we can be like a little more judging like the choice versus how hard they are to get. Right. Then again, it also biases towards, okay, well, those players are doing all certain types of content that other players are not doing, right? So there's a lot of of trying to read the tea leaves to understand exactly what's going on there.
You have to consider, well, what is an MR8 player even doing right now versus what the people have left to do if they're MR25.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they're probably not going to do Titania's quest. They probably did that when they were MR8, right?
Yeah, they did it back in the day.
Right. So yeah, it's really interesting. So does like the play rate for Wukong obviously is quite high. Does that remain pretty consistent with those higher MRs?
Yeah, Wukong actually. So if you saw that table, like there's a dot and then there were 3 dots.
Yeah.
You remember those? If I change to like MR25 and above, Wukong stays where it is. Those three, 2 of them drop, 1 of them stays. The one that stays is Bolt.
Here, I'm gonna pull up the chart right now. I have this. Oop, this is the wrong thing. Open this. There we go. I have the chart here. I've gotten the labels that we have so far
the ones
here.
that I given. Okay, well, so you have Bolt there. Bolt stays. One of those other the other 2 dots on the top. One is Titania and the other is Excalibur.
One is Titania.
One is Titania, the other is Excalibur. Siren is well to the left, which people don't expect.
Interesting.
If I remember correctly, the blue dot that's very high, in fact, is maybe the highest other than Wukong, that's Mag.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Interesting.
For example, Mag is used by less people, but is used more than most frames, right? So people that once they figure out Mag, they can really special, because Mag can do a lot if you know how to use her.
Oh, yeah.
You just can be a little, you can just take a little bit more to get used to her than someone like Bolt.
Yeah. She requires more kind of like enemy setup. Enemies kind of need to be in the right spot.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
if you know how to use her, people return more to her.
So have you noticed, is there like, I don't know if you've looked into this particular stat, but whenever we looked at like the 2021 usage charts, there was like fewer people that started with Mag versus starting with Excal and Volt, with Volt being second and Excal being first. Do the people that tend to start as Mag tend to just stay as Mag and just like hang out there and not really branch out and kind of achieve this play rate?
Not really. Like people do diversify after a while. People stay for a few mastery ranks. They stay generally in the same frame, but eventually they branch out. The reality is that generally they go into Rhino. That's generally and there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, that's like the easier to acquire unkillable frame. That's like if your first unkillable frame would be Rhino that can basically carry you through whatever.
And it certainly helps that I would say pretty much the whole community pushes everyone towards Rhino, right?
Absolutely. Like a lot of the reasons that a lot of this happens is also because of like the narratives in the community, and those kind of there's a lot of like top 5 Warframes that you should get, and that I'm sure you have some of those videos. I don't know.
No, yeah, well, yeah, I usually go in for the every Warframe ranked or whatever, but
So there's always like the rank tiers and all of that stuff. I for example, I play Genshin. I look at those things too.
Yep.
Like who are the S tiers? Okay,
which one of these characters should I pull in Genshin?
Yeah, that it does tend to be kind of like a self-fulfilling sort of cycle, right?
Yeah, because if the information that whenever people go, what frame is good, and everyone says Rhino, it's like, well, I guess that's going to be the one.
Yeah, essentially. And then from there, generally from Rhino, once they get used to, they do tend to sometimes bounce back to their original pick from like the first three. Once they get a little more gear, and then they don't die as much and all of that sort of.
Right.
That's kind of the flow.
So in terms of this chart, obviously, if you just remove Wukong from it, everything gets a lot closer together, right?
Indeed.
Do you think, like, excluding Wukong, do you think that we're at like a pretty healthy distribution, or where would you like kind of the group to move, really?
I think there's value to having different types of I wouldn't want to have like every single frame to be in like the same dot,
Well,
I
right.
know that sounds like the ideal, but you also want to have some frames that are more like people that like them really like them. In fact, like if I look at this chart, I think maybe that pink dot is Nesha, which I use Nesha a lot.
Oh yeah, hey, I
So
fully understand. Nesha's fantastic.
So you can see those are higher than the rest. That means the people that play them a lot, right? So, and I really like that there's some frames that are more like people specialize in those frames, and those are kind of like the ones they sort of gravitate to. And it's totally fine, because you do need to have, once you have 49 and now 50 frames,
Yeah.
you do need to have some that are a little more complicated to use than others. And that can be a rewarding gameplay for some people, but for some other people will say, why am I going to bother with Garuda when I can do the same with Bolt but easier, right? So
Right.
there'll be like those sorts of like vibes of like, why do the hard part,
Right.
And
Yeah,
when
because some
will
people just
say,
attach to the complexity, right?
right, and some people will find that complexity rewarding, they'll find the gameplay more engaging, whatnot, right? So you do want to have those that are not, maybe they're not for everyone, but they appeal to certain players, because there's not really point in having 49 frames that are trying to be good for everyone, because that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, because you can only, once you've tried to make every frame the same amount of good, you've kind of designed yourself into a box, right? Because they all have to do the same stuff at that point.
Yeah, pretty much. Some of the things that I was seeing today for Wukong is like, well, why don't you make the bottom 12 frames just as good as Wukong? It's like, well, Wukong, a lot of the things that he has is that he can do a lot of AFK things.
Right.
Do we really want to make 12 frames be very good at AFKing? Yeah, probably not.
Yeah,
right? Like that doesn't sound healthy for the game.
Right. And that also, with that, the AFK type stuff on Wukong, back whenever the 2021 stats got released, I was really surprised to see Wukong initially, because I was not really considering the types of content people were doing. And I asked Rebecca at the time, and she said that a lot of Wukong is actually players that are doing sorties and captures and just really not switching frames very much, because he's kind of able to do kind of everything. Which is interesting, because does his capability to be kind of a all-in-one tool, is that part of like what is really putting him up here, is that people don't have to switch for anything?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some frames that are very good, like all-arounders, that kind of no matter where you take them, they're going to do good, because they have good survivability, they have good mobility, they have decent damage, that they're not the best at anything, but they're very good at most things, right? So those frames, you can, kind of like I was saying earlier, that's Nesha for me. I put on Nesha and I can go do any mission and, do me good.
Yeah, Nesha will figure it out.
Yeah, so that's kind of I think that definitely benefits Wukong in terms of usability, and that's totally fine. I mean, it is totally fine to have like a jack of all trades that's very good at most things. Generally, that I wouldn't have any objection to that. The problem becomes once you can have, and you've seen this over the years, whenever we change some things, whenever you can have something that can be macro, or that can be,
oh yes,
that can be, you can essentially not play.
Yeah, through walls, Ataraks and such.
Yeah. And I think, for example, you were saying that it surprised you in 2021. I think in 2021, the AoE meta wasn't as established as it is now.
Right.
And that's really what makes a big difference in why it was kind of okay at some point, but it's not okay now, because now that that combination of the two things has really impacted, especially impacted other players. And
Yeah.
that's when it becomes disruptive for other players to play. That's when it becomes the most problematic.
Yeah, so with AoE being problematic, I feel like I've noticed some trends with kind of new AoE weapons is that they are a bit more engaged. So like looking at like the Nataruk and the Latum, for example, obviously the Latum requires its like, getting headshots transform mechanic to get to that really good AoE stuff because the Latum is fantastic. And the Nataruk is obviously extremely powerful, but you need to time your shots appropriately to see that power. Do you think that instead of AoE, like, what everyone kind of expects and what everyone says is like, oh, we'll just nerf all the AoE guns so that they no longer exist, right? Do you think instead we'll move more towards the AoE weapons having more mechanical depth like that, so that it has to be more engaging for the player and that higher effort is what pays off for them? So you can't just, fire the Kuvazar down a hallway and be like, well, anything in that hallway is gone. I don't have to think about it.
Well, obviously, I don't want to go into like the detail exactly of what's going on there. Obviously,
Well, sure. But just like the big picture of like kind of the goals, right?
In big picture, obviously, rewinding backwards, like going back to all the ones that are already the problem. It's hard to go back and change them to be like those cases that you mentioned. I do, but we are aware for the future to try and be more about like, okay, AoE is cool, but let's try and make it about big moments versus all the time.
Right.
Like don't make it so that you're basically blowing everything all the time with no downtime. Just so that's kind of that's when those sorts of skill checks or either the time aiming or the additional game mode kind of enters, right? You feel really powerful with the Latham when you switch to the mode, right? You get that power fantasy and you do feel like you're destroying everything, but then you go back to the other cycle and that kind of keeps it a little more peaks and valleys.
Yeah, because like, I mean, and it's nice with the Latum because like the Latum is powerful in both forms, but it just does very different things in both forms.
Yeah.
And then we've kind of seen some of that direction even in the past, really, with like the Brahma. Whenever it was changed, it was like a very heavy reduction in ammo, so you had to always you couldn't just stand in one place. You had to make sure you were grabbing ammo from sources and things of that nature. So it's interesting, like we might not see, the big no more AoE that everyone's scared of course, but instead maybe just more interesting things where people have to, do a little more to get there, right?
For the most part, like just in general terms, not even only for this, but also for abilities and for all sorts of things, my preference generally is trying to not maintain the same sort of intensity throughout a mission. You want to have those changes.
Right.
And I think about this, for example, with someone like I'm gonna answer what you're asking, but with a different example, which
That's
is for
totally
example,
fine with me. I'm into it.
Something like an exalted weapon, which can feel really cool when you pull out your exalted blade. But then after that, you start swinging, and if you never run out of energy, you never run out of anything, the rest of your gameplay becomes very similar. You're always swinging your sword and shooting the lasers and stuff, and you never get those peaks and valleys. It's always you get to the peak and then just kind of stays there, and there's no variance on the gameplay for you to make kind of decisions and feel like the status of the game is kind of changing.
Right.
Similarly with power, ideally, you're doing the Latham, you're landing those headshots, and that's part of there's one kind of cadence of gameplay. Then you switch to the AoE, and then changes the cadence, and then you do those back and forths.
Right.
And ideally also during those those headshots, there's other things to change the variance, such as an Eximus comes out, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
All
you have
those,
a couple knocks show up. There's a Bursas spawn and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So with that, obviously there were the Eximus changes, and like just kind of going back to the frames and everything. Did the Eximus changes change a lot of kind of the left side of this graph, do you think? Because I think the Eximus changes, from my point of view, maybe disproportionately affected certain frames just due to what their immunities are. Were there movements at that point, or not really still?
They were not really. Like, I think those are more like In reality, if you put the changes of Eximus on paper, I think you'd say like, well, you cannot crowd control them, so that's the end of crowd control frames. But if you actually like do it in game for like in Saruman, for example, for the most part, you're gonna 3-4 shot them, right? Like it's not changing like radically what it used to be. It is radically changing some situations where you could like stand in one place and assume that your CC would capture them all, or
Right.
things like that are changing. But since you don't get that rushed by that many Eximus at once, and when they come out, it's not like they're bullet sponges, or at least not for the
Yeah, I mean,
not for
maybe on
level
the
of
steel path
player.
occasionally, right?
Yeah, and there I like that, to be honest. Like in Stale Path, I do like that you see one and you go like, oh, I better take care of that guy because otherwise he's just gonna be CC'd.
Just gonna mow me down.
Which, yeah, which I think before you had a lot of moments. I remember watching just like playtests of like around MR 1012s playing level 20 missions, and they would kill Eximus without noticing.
Right.
Because they literally was just like one more guy in the crowd that just kind of disappeared as they just passed around with Soma or whatever.
Yeah,
Like
this new guy was glowy.
yeah, it's if they even notice that, right? 'Cause
Right.
like also those effects were way more like tamed down in comparison to like the new ones, more glowing and whatnot. So
And right now I would say they're very clear whenever they show up, for sure.
right. So yeah, that's basically what I think. Like in practice, for most people, like it didn't change that much. I do think that for some people that had like planned strategies for like, I'm gonna go to Steel Path and stay in this closet and just use Necros and Smita and maybe for them it got a little trickier, but just a little.
Yeah, just a little.
As you know, just a little.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So in that though, is there because the Eximus do have that crowd control immunity though, there are a number of frames that rely fairly solely on that, like Vauban, for not necessarily like going back to any frames, but like for future design, is there more other survivability type stuff that you want to do? Or is crowd control going to continue to be kind of like some frames whole thing? Because we have some frames that like really are known for like just being that, and that seems like it's less so in more recent frames.
Yeah, I mean, what happened like more in the beginning, we had more like, here's a DPS frame, here's a healer frame, here's a CC frame. That's kind of how we started. Then, curiously enough, the ones that were a problem were the damage ones, right? Because they were not scaling enough. So then we started adding CC to all of those, right? We started doing like, okay, well, now every time you do damage, you also do CC, so that way it scales, right? So that you can actually do high-level enemies, and this ability doesn't fall off because now it has this extra stun, extra stagger, so on and so forth. Oh, now you're dying too much. Okay, well, let me give you a little survivability.
Yep.
And we started doing that, and we started doing a lot of frames that are very that can basically be very self-sufficient. Downside of that is any frames that were very based on healing, like Trinity, like they lost a lot of them. I remember there was a time where you would see a Trinity in every squad.
Oh
right?
yeah, yes,
You wanted
absolutely.
a Trinity there.
Yeah, Trinity,
No.
I mean, for a while there, she had that 99% damage reduction that she was rolling around with, and that was a crazy
that
time.
and energy regen, like those were really important. Now most frames can achieve energy self-sufficiency with, arcanes or focus, or there's a whole bunch of different ways to get yourself into a fully sustainable energy economy that you don't really even have to think about too much. Right. And then there's a lot of frames that can be full on completely immortal, and a whole bunch that can be very close.
Yeah.
So, in this new Warframe frame that mostly just offers support, starts having a hard time finding a spot, right? Like where does that leave her? Similarly, happens for a frame that is fully based around CC. When everyone has a little bit of CC, even if it's not as good as what Boban can offer, it's tough for Boban to say like, "Hey, I can do that better." And it's like, well, we're okay, man. We can just like, I don't need a 20-second CC when in 3 seconds I can CC them and kill them, right? So
Right.
that is kind of where it's gone. And it's a combination of factors. The main one I would say is probably the fact that more and more frames can do all the things, and the general power creep of the game that also leads to time to kill has come down and come down and come down and come down, and that generally leads to CC losing a lot of its value.
Right. And then so for the energy economy, obviously you mentioned that there are ways to, patch up your energy and get going, Zeneric, energize, dissipate, depending. Dissipate obviously recently got changed, so that was adjusted quite a bit. So a lot of those options though are not very available to like newer players, and I know a lot of players like myself, like just looking at what new players do, it feels like a lot of them want to be able to cast their abilities much more often, but they just don't have the economy to do so. Are there any considerations for, obviously late game we have many tools to change around energy, but for early game and things that are more focused towards the beginning of the game, is there any interest in like making that economy better for the newer players?
So I was actually recently watching a video where you participated in the MMO.
Oh yeah,
YouTube needs
Josh's video.
you. Oh, yeah, and he had like just B-roll of Warframe behind the scenes, and it was just him playing. And I was literally just cringing because he had like full energy and wasn't using an ability, and I was like yelling at the screen like, "Please, please,
Please cast something."
Yeah. So I do think like there's both sides of that. One is like we need to help a bit on making on getting those abilities to get used a little bit more. I mentioned in the Tenocon Q&A thing that we're basically making some changes to the 3 starters. A lot of those changes
is it
are
all 3 of them?
center. Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was only Excal and Mag that had been mentioned at Tenocon.
No, it's all 3. To different degrees, I would say.
Of course. I mean, they're all different, right?
Yeah. And they all need different amounts of help, right? Like I was saying earlier, the bolt dot doesn't move, no matter how mystery you go to. So, he obviously needs less help. In any case, a lot of the changes for those are surrounding around making you feel a little more powerful when you're using your abilities at lower ranks. Kind of similar to the changes we made with arcanes, where basically they used to have several stats that scaled, making essentially their power exponential with rank. It's sort of similar to that concept. If an ability has range, duration, strength, damage, and blah blah blah, maybe make some of those kind of the same value across all ranks, so that even from the beginning you get access to a little bit more power.
Yeah.
In terms of the economy of the energy itself, we do have some thoughts, but way too early to share. But like we do, definitely something that we do want to review at some point. We're having a chat about this week, but it is definitely on our minds.
Well, those changes are, from based on what we heard on Tenocon, those are kind of fast approaching, right? I mean, that's Veilbreaker's the next major update, and that they're supposed to be around there, right?
Yeah, those are already done and kind of just waiting, just a couple more like effects passes and stuff like that. But other than that, it's they're pretty much there. They are, just to kind of put the expectation clear. Again, I'm very focused in this to kind of like towards the starting player. So don't expect that this will mean that Radial Javelin now will be awesome against level 9,999 enemies.
Right.
Yeah, that's not what that's not where we're going.
Just make all 3 of them infinitely scale, so you never have to switch frames, right? It'll be really simple.
You'll be fine. Some of the changes, of course, will benefit everyone, but they're mostly aimed at how does it feel to play them early on, kind of thing.
Right, which makes a lot of sense because the early part of the game, I think it is very, very different from where you get later. Like just adding a few mods on really changes up things quite a bit. We did hear that at TennoCon you mentioned Grendel as one of the frames that you'd like to work on, but like there's not the time for it. Or like, working that into the schedule can be very difficult because obviously you're working on so many things at once, just trying to get things where they need to go. In terms of frame reworks and like the time investment of that, how much, like how, I don't want to say easy because it's never easy, right? But like how much has to go into rework like a frame if you're also working on a major update? Is like that like a whole crew of people that always has to be pulled off, or are there like more smaller changes that are pretty simple to do?
It really depends on the frame. Like if I think, for example, back to, we were talking about Wukong. If I think back to that change, we changed several abilities. We changed a lot of things on that one, right? So if you are like kind of revamping the whole kit, they take a long time, right? Because you need to get new audio, new effects, new animations, and a lot of time that is. So generally, when you're making anything, you're making a new frame, you're making a new system, you're making a whatever, it's a very iterative process, right? So you try something, you see how it feels, you like and dislike certain things, you change them, you try them again, and you kind of do that loop over and over. If you're making a rework that's mostly, change some stats, adjust a little bit of a mechanic and stuff like that, it's almost like you're starting on an iteration pretty far ahead, You're iterating on something that has already been working. So you're just kind of improving it.
Right.
If you are actually going in and saying like, you know what, this ability just doesn't work, then it's kind of like you have to start like, literally from zero. So it can take a long time. So it really depends on where you go. In the case of Grendel, for example, like I do have some ideas on how to get him without having to throw everything away, but I do also think he's a dangerous Warframe.
Oh yes.
I almost think we got lucky with the fact that he's so unpopular, because since he can suck out basically every AI in the game. If he was popular, he could make every other player miserable, right? So,
if he gets too good at eating all of the enemies, then there's no enemies for anyone to fight, right?
Yeah. So it kind of becomes like old Limbo, where if you saw a Limbo in your party, you were like, oh, no, not again. Because you knew you wouldn't be able to play as long as that Limbo was around.
Right.
So I feel like if we're not careful with Grendel, he has potential to do that, right? So, in that sense, it's it almost sounds weird, but I think in order to buff Grendel, the first thing I gotta do is nerf him, because I gotta take care of, like, I cannot make a frame that's very popular that also takes out 40 enemies at once out of the enemy pool, because that's all the enemies, right? So.
Right. Yeah, and like, so I guess for Grendel, would you say he's very focused on his one right now, and you'd probably like want to shift focus to a different ability for him to be doing stuff, as opposed to just eating everyone? Would it be more about like his meatball if you were to make changes to him or something along those lines?
I tend to be very much like the way I like to make frames. I like to make them pretty active in terms of like which abilities you're using. My ideal generally is like one ability that you maintain. And this is very loosely, like I don't.
Of course, it's all a skeleton, right? Every frame is different.
Yeah. Generally, I like to have like one ability that you maintain. You once you have mods and stuff, you'll cast it once every 40 to 60 seconds. Then one ability that you often use, that you can be pretty reactive to and be using often. Protest 2, Eurolist 1, that kind of thing that you're using kind of pretty often. Neshus 2, those sorts of abilities, and then something that you can be more on the lookout for opportunities to use, and that would be the ultimates and stuff like that, right? So that's kind of how I like to structure things. I generally dislike anything that stays very flat. Chroma cast 2 abilities and then just maintain them the rest of the mission.
They just kind of hang out in him.
Yeah. Generally, I don't. I really dislike that type of gameplay where it just feels like it's it's almost busy work with the way that works, right? Because you're just sustaining those 2 things. So I don't. So I generally am more looking for. I am looking for anything that can combo abilities, or that one depends on the other, or that at least you have some. Maybe in the case of Grendel, obviously there is some order dependencies right now, which is that you have to cast the one before you can cast the others.
Yeah.
Right now, maybe it's a little too locked, but there is some stuff there that kind of interacts in interesting ways.
Yeah, you got to eat people before you can roll them up or like spit them into crowds or any of his
Yeah.
different combinations. And I would say, like, in terms of that style that you just described, like the first frame, and obviously we don't know. You may have worked on other ones before, but the one that I would say you got like the big credit for right whenever it came out was Nidus, and Nidus very much encapsulates that playstyle of using your one very actively and very often, and that feeding into the larger things that Nidus gets to do. And obviously, Nidus, I mean, from what you've said, or from what has been publicly released, like Nidus Prime was the highest selling Prime Access ever at that point whenever it came out, which is indicative, I think, of how much people like Nidus.
Okay, I have no idea about that stat, but if you say it, then I'll believe you. Generally, on purpose, I try to never look at any sort of things like sales numbers and stuff like that, because you don't want to. I never want to decide to change something to like, could this make more money? That's never the vibe. But yeah, Nidus, I think, encapsulates very clearly the sort of stuff I like. I like someone that you're casting often, that you're making some decisions every now and then. You see some enemies that are bunched up, you use your 2. You feel like you're getting attacked a lot, you use your 3 to stay alive, or maybe you feel like you're pretty safe because you have a Trinity. Maybe you use your 3 with a friend to get more power. You have some decisions to be made. You're going to stay in an area for a while, you press your 4. There's like a whole... there's decisions to be made as you're playing, and that's kind of what I like and try to seek, in the gameplay.
So in that kind of survivability vein, in terms of just like the general survivability of frames, obviously there's crowd control or just general damage reduction like Nidus has access to, and then just your raw amount of health like we see with Inaros. Do you find that, generally speaking, where the base stats are of the frames is pretty good for what you want for a general survivability, especially early on? Or do you think that like those numbers are... Because survivability, I feel, is like greatly influenced by if they have an ability in their kit that gives them that damage reduction of high amounts, and that's going to really influence if they can survive at all in a lot of cases? Or do you feel like maybe there's an equalization of bringing a lot of frames up in base survivability that could influence survival not being so hinged on those abilities?
I think in general what happens that is pretty hard to kind of work around is that if you look at most RPG games and stuff like that, generally they'll have like, oh, here's your thing that increases HP plus 25% HP or plus 50% HP, right? We have plus 440%.
Yeah.
Right? So generally for us, like the proportion of base stats to stats once you put on all the stuff that we have in the game, that is just like an exponential thing. There is not even comparable, right? Like so
like the numbers are just they're so different, right? Like Inaros is gaining 3,000, Banshee is getting 400.
Yeah. And it's like a non-modded Inaros versus a modded Inaros is like not night and day. It's like, night in Earth versus the day in Pluto. It's like it's 2 different things. And because of how much that changes, it makes it hard to make it very survivable at the bottom. And I think you saw it very recently with the operator. Like we had this problem with the operator, right? Like we need the operator to work in Angels of Saruman. But in that environment, we're already expecting players to have a whole bunch of mods and a whole bunch of arcanes and to know about how to stay alive. But the operator doesn't have all those things, right? So they don't have all those tools to get themselves super buff. So what do? Well, we need to increase the base because the the curve of upgrades that they have access to is much smaller than the curve of upgrades that a Warframe has. So that forced us to increase the base to kind of catch up a little bit. And we were dreading a little bit of it because we literally saw the joke like the day after, and there was someone like had like a I don't even remember. I think it was like Valkyr standing next to the operator, and the operator had no health.
Right.
Yeah, we knew that was absurd, but at the same time, almost every option that we had at that point was a little like, well, are we gonna give them a whole bunch of armor? All of a sudden, they're like armored kids. Like that doesn't make any sense either. So
yeah,
that's kind of because of how crazy those upgrade curves and those power curves are. Is very hard to keep those things under control. So taking that back a little step is if I increase the base of how much Excalibur can survive, well, that curve just grows more, right? Like I'm exponentially increasing that, right? When I give him 100 health, at the end I'm giving him 2,000 EHP or whatever. I don't know exactly how much I end up giving him, but it's a whole bunch, right? Depending on what armor he has and what. So that's kind of the problem there with making it more survivable in the bottom is that you affect the top a lot. It's a bit. It's a bit chaos theory in that the flap of the wing of a butterfly ends up being a hurricane. Well, it's kind of like that, really. Anything I do at the base becomes a whole ton because the exponential curve on top is so big.
Well, I assume obviously you've thought about this for sure, but is there a reluctancy to change like the survivability mods, like going back and being like, well, vitality, changing those health values and being like, from the ground up, we're going to change how health is, and being like, vitality is now, let's say 1,300 health instead of being 400%. Is there a reluctancy to go back and make changes to mods like that just because people have an investment in them, or is there like more technical reasons perhaps about that?
There's no technical reasons. It is literally just a community reason, which is essentially that we've always been very cautious about preserving, the investment that players do. We very reluctantly ever change anything. We don't want to remove mods, even if the mod is not super useful. We don't want to remove it because we know some people will use it. And you've seen whenever we've had to remove one, we generally do like a legendary core or something like that to be like super, like way on the side of like, sorry for taking this away from you kind of thing. So. Yeah, have we ever thought about it? Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I would love to have one of those Men in Black sticks and just make everyone forget and just change the whole thing. You make my life easier.
Like, don't think about this. No one remembers it. I made it perfectly balanced. We figured it out.
Yeah, that is kind of the thing. And I mean, obviously this happens in a lot of games, but I think because we started with such a big ramp up, the fact that you could get, over 100% crit chance, or like 200%, 300%, you can, the fact that you can do those sorts of things make it really hard to kind of keep things under control. In a sense for balancing, and we are under no illusion. Like I'm very clear on the fact that balance is not something we have, and is not something that we prioritize very highly. I think in for the most part, because the content we have is not like mega demanding. There is not a reason for people to become super obsessed with min maxing. So the main people that do it for fun. The people that want to do the level 9,999 steel path will find out how to do it with every single frame, because there is a way. And I'll watch sometimes the YouTube videos because they're kind of fun to see the ridiculous things that they're doing, and and that's
where
kind
they've
of
taken it.
To see how far you can take it because of all those tools that we have for you to change things around.
And generally, like the main content of the game stays very accessible no matter kind of what your skill level with modding is, because we saw obviously with Angels of the Zarmon that came out and it was level I think 55, and then it got toned down to I think it's 45 now. And those changes to a lot of people that are watching this stream and myself, it's a negligible change for someone like me, but for a lot of the player base that I think a lot of people don't think about, you can tell me if this is actually the case or not, I suppose. It makes a much more difference for them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We saw it particularly, and I think this was a good lesson for us. We saw it particularly in the quest, because, of course, we were kind of reusing those same missions, but the problem is during the quest, you're forced to be solo, right?
Right.
Where the reality is, like right now, if I went in as with like no gear at all to a mission in Angels of Simon, I'm gonna get carried easily. There's no question about it. But if I have to do it solo, that's
things are going to be a lot more
so,
difficult.
yeah. So yeah, we definitely we missed the mark there on the difficulty for the quest. So a lot of players found it really punishing, especially there. And then we started kind of doing adjustments, and we kind of knew, again, like kind of going a little bit back on the Eximus, we where they were. Actually, I'm going to go even further back to one that I did, and then I had to change a lot, which was the Wolf.
Oh,
Wolf of Saturn, right? So I remember I was balancing him with some weapons, and I was like, "Oh, this is easy."
right.
I was soloing him, no problem.
Super simple
Level
stuff.
100,
Yep.
it's easy. And then once he came out, everyone was like, "No, please, this is impossible." And yeah, of course, like the problems, obviously, the wolf can appear anywhere, so sometimes it's hard to be prepared for him. So of course, when I was trying him, I have all the frames, I have all the mods, I have all the things. For me, it was very easy, and I didn't feel like I was using even like meta stuff. I was just using like
Just
normal
fun,
stuff.
your favorite weapon, right?
And for me, it was very easy. But yeah, once it was outside, it was like, holy shit, this is impossible. And sometimes it's easy to forget sometimes that how many different types of people play the game, and a lot of people want to play it a little more relaxed and casual. So we gotta be a little more careful with, making those higher levels, having them accessible, but through the sorties, for example, I think that's great, right? Because
Oh, for sure.
not through the sorties, but now actually I meant the bounties. Through the bounties in AOC, having those extra levels and those extra difficulties, so that people can actually engage with that. I think that's a good way to sort of solve that.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I think the quest personally did a really good job of just introducing the Zarmon and kind of getting people into the way that it works. Speaking of like those different kind of levels of player, though, do you think? Obviously, we don't know one way or another, but assuming that like Wukong would be brought down, because one could assume from the chart, right? Do you think that there are a lot of much more casual players that would feel like they've been negatively affected if Wukong doesn't have that type of AoE stuff? Or do you feel like most of those players aren't really in the realm where they have access to the kind of Wukong strategies that are pretty dominating?
I think for those dominant strategies, they wouldn't be. But obviously, anytime you bring, it's kind of like what I was saying earlier. Just I'm trying to change the starter frames to help new players, but that also is gonna go to the top, right? So when like very experienced back players see the new pool, they're gonna be like salivating, right? So I didn't change it with that intent, but because of changing it for starting players, it becomes better for everyone.
Yeah.
And when I have to change something to nerf something on the top, it's also going to cascade down, right? So there's no real two ways about that. How much do you do? Well, that's when you try as much as you can to go into the house of cards and remove the one card without bringing everything down, right? That's
Right.
kind of the way you have to do it. Will they be affected? Yeah, of course. Like any change that we do there to his general power level will come down, but ideally we can localize the changes in a way that is not too severe for the average player.
Yeah, just not too violent for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is there any? How do I put this? Or whenever you nerf, like if you have to nerf something, because sometimes it's just out of control or just not in line with the rest of the game, right? Is there like a general pause for it, or a feeling like you need to trade in some way where you need to buff something else if you're nerfing this thing? Or is it more about just what needs to be done right now, whether or not like there's a community balance to be had?
I think it's it definitely has been a growing experience, and generally, whenever we had to do it, I mean, there's a few reasons that, and even within the team, we have different reasons why we think it should be done. Generally, for me, is like anything that can be automated needs to be gone.
Oh, for sure.
Anything that's totally prohibitive for other players needs to be changed. You know, like if something one person does affects others, that needs to be changed, or anything that's just so absolutely dominant that basically it makes other choices feel unviable. Like you almost feel bad if you're not using that because clearly you're doing it wrong if you're not using X or Y. So generally my general reasons. In terms of how we generally tend to do it, we do go for the approach of the hug and the kick.
Right.
You know, that's kind of you gotta do a kick, give him a hug first, and that's kind of how we try to do it. If I'm being like, so we've done this several times where we nerf one weapon and then buff at the same time 20 others.
Oh, yes.
Like literally. And then the next day we look at, I mean, not throwing any rocks here, but we see like the YouTube videos and stuff is like, nerfs, oh my God, this is the end. You know, generally the hug and the kick makes us feel better. I don't know how effective it is for the community, because generally they kind of fixate on the one nerf, and I'm sure it's going to be like that when and if something happens to the monkey. I'm sure if it comes out along with, you know, however many buffs there are for Excalibur and Mag, I'm sure that I know what the title of the YouTube is going to be.
Well, it's always a variation, right? It's whatever is the bigger concern in the community.
Yeah. And obviously, you know, this is not exclusive to video games in general. Obviously, we always pay attention more to the thing that we perceive as bad is like the one that kind of pops immediately, and you're like, oh, I gotta find out what did this politician do now?
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
And I think it's so just in terms of obviously balance, like you've mentioned, Warframe is not. It's not like entirely predicated on being a perfectly balanced experience all the way through. It's interesting. Is there ever any want to just change things for the sake of changing them, just to have like a mix up, or just shuffle it to be like, I want these weapons to be like these weapons should be interesting for a while, or it would be really nice if these weapons mechanically that are very interesting were much more powerful, so you see more experiences with them. Is there any tendency towards balancing not based on kind of when someone would get something or how far it is in MR progression, and just in terms of these weapons aren't good, and no matter where they are, it would be interesting if they were good?
They generally come with a reason. There generally is like some other prompt, because it is basically, with a game the size of Warframe, our attention is very like split on many things, right? So
oh yeah, you've 9 years of content to look at all times.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's like, okay, well, are you looking forward or are you looking backwards? Which one are you? We have a lot of things on the back catalog that obviously we go back and try and touch up, but we also have a lot in the future that we also obviously have to focus. And sometimes it's tough to know where the return on investment is exactly. So we do try to switch things up, but generally we would only do it for things that are like, this is totally neglected.
Right.
We actually, I'm not going to tell you which, because that's we're going to say it on the dev stream, I imagine. But, to the kind of almost the exact case that you just suggested, there is one such as that for the next update.
Cool. Well, I mean, it's always, hey, from my perspective, whenever the entire game gets flipped upside down, that's a lot of videos that need to be made, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, not so those are. I mean, I can't tell you for sure that I've definitely felt gun shy sometimes for anything that's a nerf, because you feel like, okay, well, I'm gonna change this. You gotta ask yourself, okay, what is it actually gonna accomplish? You know, like I can see something that I think maybe is not. Something that doesn't make sense, that I just don't think it actually, like it shouldn't work like that. But I think, well, if I change it, exactly what is it going to improve? What am I going to get in change? Because
Right.
I know for sure I'm going to get a whole lot of angry posts. So what besides that am I going to get? Because I need to get something that makes me happy, you know?
Yeah.
So
I mean, if there's no positive for you, even if it's a bug, it's like that's a feature. We're not fixing that. That would make people angry for nothing.
yeah, so we often get some of those where it feels like, well, this is probably not the healthiest design for X, or this is probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but we're just gonna upset people, and it is tough. It is tough to commit to those things, just because. You also, like, no one has the desire of angering the community ever, right? So that's not like a thing. And I think for a game like this, like, talking about balance, some live games that have as many characters as we have,
Which is few.
there's not a lot of PvE ones, I can tell you that.
Oh yeah.
Most of them are PvP, and in the PvP, the balancing is easier because since people are in the receiving end of the pain as well as in the giving, they're way more open to nerfs and stuff like that, right? Which if you had to fight Rhino, you probably want to nerf his iron skin, right? So
right.
So that's kind of the vibe. So obviously, for us, it's more like we got to pick our battles. It's kind of how I feel about it. So even though in a PvE game they generally try to like open the meta every now and then so that it keeps it fresh and stuff, for us it's a little harder to do that without ruffling too many feathers.
Right. And then, speaking of ruffling too many feathers, I suppose, very related to just the general state of any given Warframe, does the Helminth system make it harder to change those powers? Because, just every frame has access to potentially all of those abilities, right?
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, obviously, just like we have usage stats for every frame, we also have usage stats for all the Helminth abilities. And I probably don't have to tell you exactly what number one is because you probably already know because it's what everyone puts in the same
well
spot. So that is kind of sometimes you find yourself in like in the loop of thinking, well, if we change now every frame in the game has an ability that slows everyone down, that slows all enemies in an area. So what does that mean? Well, it's not great. It's not great. But now if you nerf that one ability, you're nerfing everyone, right? So it's like,
and it's kind of about that trade-off, right? Like, what do you gain and what do you lose? Because I would say personally, some frames are kind of riding on having access to that. Otherwise, they become considerably kind of less competitive with other frames that are available.
I would say yes and no. I think I do think like that term of competitive is more is definitely more reserved for a certain part of the community.
Sure.
For a lot of the people were using Protea before they could pull everything with Nidus's too, right?
Right.
Like,
oh, for sure.
Sure. Now she's stronger, but they were using her before.
Yeah. I mean, hey, Protea is my favorite frame. I will use Protea. Whether or not she has Helminth doesn't matter.
So I feel like it gives you more options, but I don't know. Sometimes when I see people are like, oh, they're releasing this augment that's a band-aid or something like that, it almost feels like they think like it's like preloaded DLC that that when we made the frame we kept this behind just to save it for them. No, these things are just ideas that come later. And generally, yeah, you when you make an augment, you're generally looking at like, okay, what kind of frame? If the frame can already survive infinitely, then you're not going to give it an augment to survive more, right? Like there's no.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
And that, I guess with the augment thing, I mean, I see this suggestion all the time. Is there any consideration for like an augment slot? Because a lot of people, it gets brought up I'm sure you've thought about it. I mean, I
Yeah.
see it said so many times, but is there any interest in that? Or do you I am of the opinion that augments kind of have to earn their slot in a Warframe, but I'm curious what your like just general feeling is on how an augment is.
Yeah, I'm fairly opposed to it. Just in general, I feel like if you look at the builds for Warframes, they're in a I wouldn't say they're in an amazing spot, but they're in a much better spot than, for example, the weapon builds.
Mm,
You know, a weapon you'll build it the exact same way every time for all eternity,
yeah.
right? And I feel like augments are the ones that force a little bit of a harder choice, where you have to look at your build and say, okay, I cannot fit everything I want
Mm,
because I need to fit this thing. So what am I going to take off? So at
right.
least you're making some decisions there that are a little more interesting
Mm,
than fit everything, which I think is kind of where I feel like that way whenever I have like a frame, like right now, if I build Gyre, I feel like I'm not missing anything because I could just put everything in there.
mhm,
I have no pressure to actually have to make a choice about what I cannot fit.
mhm,
I'll have some choices, like, maybe I can choose between two auras or something like that. But for the most part, I feel like I can fit absolutely everything. And the only thing on other frames that's making me make more, a bit harder choices is that augment.
right.
So I would hate to lose that because I definitely miss it when it comes to building a weapon where I do feel like I can fit, that I can find a perfect build that works for pretty much every weapon.
Yeah, because if you have that augment slot, it's also kind of it doesn't achieve that because you release one augment for a Warframe, and then obviously it goes in the augment slot at that point. There's no decision making to be had, which would the decision making is obviously a big part of the building.
Yeah, yeah, that is essentially what I feel like we would lose if we were to do the augment slot. So um, unless something else more radical were to change, I'm pretty sure that I want to keep it that way. So you have to make that choice between an augment or putting, another stat mod,
Mhm. Yeah,
which does make
personally,
it
I
so that
completely agree.
it does make it so that some augments just simply are not worth the value. Like, I totally get that, and
Yeah.
we've been that's part of the revision that we started earlier this year to try and buff them a little bit, and
Mhm.
we'll keep on doing and just checking the usage and keep on bumping them and
Yep.
see where they
Do
land.
a pass, give them some numbers, be like, is that enough numbers or is it not quite enough numbers?
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's always interesting. So for weapons, I guess, obviously you said that most of the builds are fairly static, and there's a couple outliers, of course, to that. Certain weapons have a mod or two that's pretty specific to them. Do you think we'll see more of a shakeup in terms of the types of mods we'll be getting and for our guns? Just to have more of that choice, like more things that are close to compare and hard to choose between?
I think that so the way that a lot of games kind of deal with this is by creating certain anchors that you cannot change. So what would that look like in Warframe? It would be like, okay, well, the Soma always has I don't know, when you get a hit proc, you get 3% crit chance and it resets whenever you get a crit.
Right.
Just to invent something on the fly.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Well, that means that now when you're building the Soma, you're going to want to try and solve that build around that particular thing and say, okay, well, then I want to get some heat procs in there to get the crit. I don't really need that much crit chance because the crit chance will get built from that. So I probably should put crit damage and so on and so forth. Or maybe I should use Ember with this so that I can get extra heat and I can also get the procs from it. That is
Mhm.
the sort of solution that you would be doing around that anchor that you cannot change,
Right.
right?
So more of
What we
a
have,
weapon having an interesting ability that is the build around, really.
yeah. and you would basically you'd synergize around that. And you see a lot of games that are similar to ours that basically that's what they do. They have one or two anchors per build that you cannot change, and then you can change everything else to try and make the most that you can out of those anchors.
And so we've seen, I mean, I think basically, like it lines up pretty exactly that kind of example with stuff like the Latum, which we talked about earlier. That final ability, obviously it got nerfed a bit, which was, I think, totally appropriate personally. But having that anchor be like, you cannot get a crit and a status together, otherwise you don't get this ability. That definitely changes up that build as long as the numbers surrounding it are in line. So do you think that we're going to see a lot more weapons that fall into the category of those more interesting choice type abilities, like the transforming weapons?
So the reality is that is how a system could work. Now, why doesn't it work like that in Warframe? Like specifically in Warframe? Well, I'll basically right now, similar to what I was saying earlier, where the base of a Warframe is like a small part of all the power that you can give it through mods, through arcanes, to whatnot. Even if we put those anchors, it'd be pretty easy for you to ignore them because you will add 2,000% of the damage of that weapon will come from the mods and the arcanes. So if you ignore that little passive, you're not losing too much. And generally, like what you would like is to have a certain ratio of anchors to things that you can change. And for us, we're like a pretty free for all where you let you change almost anything. You have so many mods, so many arcanes, so many, like you can even the Helminth, that let you change the abilities. We let you change so many things that the ideas of those anchors would lose some of their value. Will we explore a little bit more of like leaning into those anchors? We definitely will. I don't know when. You'll see a little bit of a dip of our toes on the next update. Not related to weapons, but related to Warframes a little bit, and dipping our toes into a little bit of like leaning a little bit more on those anchors. And you can actually see it also in some of the arcanes that we already came out,
Oh, yes.
Gain extra crit chance when you have over shields, right? Well, that's an anchor because you can only have over shields with certain frames.
Yep.
Right? So that kind of limits who that arcane is good with.
Yeah, or at the very least, which ones it's going to be consistent with.
Yeah. So, trying to find those sorts of things that are like more in a bit, they're a little bit like puzzles for you to figure out, like, what works well with what. I think that can lead to more interesting builds versus currently, like a lot of our weapons are essentially, is it a crit weapon or is it a status weapon?
Right.
That's the end of your check, and then that's 2 builds, and you just put the mods and you're kind of done, right? So that is sort of the sort of things that we would definitely kind of love to chip away a little bit. But it's definitely not it's not a soon TM thing.
Right. And I think that the recent arcanes did a really good job of going back to a lot of different builds and being like, of the 49 frames, these 6 want this one. It's very interesting for them. These 6 want to at least experiment with this one. And there's tons of arcanes in the more recent updates that just gave a lot of frames something different to do, or something that they can achieve now that they couldn't get to before, which is, I think, a good way that starts diversifying them in a big way.
That's definitely kind of like the things I'm more interested in sort of exploring right now, just trying to find those little what are the difference between them that I can put in so that there's a reason for you to equip this mod and not that mod, and that kind of thing.
And then going back to the big chart, which is obviously the kind of the impetus of all this, is there any frame that's on here that you would say it's the most surprising where they are?
The most surprising where they are. Well, the thing is, like, obviously, I live and breathe this game, so I don't know that I could be surprised. There's some that I would actually, Loki is kind of high for what I would expect. He's higher on depth than Ibarra, for example. So Ibarra, you can see her, she's pretty far to the right, meaning a lot of people use her, but she's pretty low. meaning they don't use it a lot. Why? Because everyone uses her, but only in spies, right? That's kind of so you can see there like the story of okay, well that's why a lot of people use her, but just a little bit. But Loki, more people use him, even though not only in spies, like they use him more. Less people use Loki than Ibarra, but they use him more. So they're using him somewhere else.
Do you think?
So
Do you think that maybe like factors into maybe a through line with kind of this whole thing of just the raw speed of a Warframe greatly affecting where they place here? Because obviously Wukong and Titania and Volt are all just intrinsically very, very fast, and Ivara has her speed debuff while she's doing her invisibility.
I think it's a combination of things because like in the case of of both Wukong and Titania, even though Titania doesn't have any like super survivability in the same way that Wukong does, the fact that she's just flying around generally means she's pretty hard to kill. There's you're not in a lot of danger most of the time, so in that sense, I think it's more of a combination of I move fast and I also do something else really good. In the case of Bolt being very easy AoE clearing, right? Like if I look specifically at the missions where he's used a lot, you'll see him very, very used on ESO and SO, like those sorts of any survival, anything with a dense amount of enemies, you'll see him used a lot.
Interesting. So that's really interesting for Volt is because whenever I made my more recent video on Volt, I really wasn't sure what was causing such like a high amount of play rate for Volt, because there's always, obviously he's the best for Eidolons, and whether or not Eidolons are like that large of a part of the player base where a lot of that usage is being factored there, or whether or not it was a lot of more general use stuff. It's interesting to hear that it's more survival and more of like that SO and like leveling and just doing AoE damage, which is kind of the opposite of what he does in Eidolons.
I haven't seen how the numbers change for Eidolons, but I have to imagine that likely they went down once we released new arcanes because there's less value to selling the old arcanes, which is what a lot of people that are redoing those old ones are basically they're farming the arcanes to then trade them. So I assume because of all the new arcane options that we released, that there's definitely a lowering on the value of those other ones. But he's very general use. Like I said, well, you have him in your graph, and if I change the graph to 25 MR plus, he pretty much stays where he is.
Right.
So
interesting. And then somebody asked in chat, which I feel like is a very good question, just in general. Do you have any just like general content on design that you've read that has influenced kind of the way that you think about this stuff? Like any just general content, like websites or books or anything of that nature?
One that I would recommend, generally, like there's that Stephen Krug book. I think it's called "Don't Make Me Think." If I remember, don't make me think. I think that's what it's called, but I'm bad at names. Yeah, "Don't Make Me Think." I think that definitely informs a lot of anything by Steve Krug is pretty good in terms of like how to think about things is kind of how I would come at it, you know. I've read a lot of design, like a lot of game design is one of those things that sometimes you're reading it and the books feel outdated for what game design, well, or for what games move faster than the books, essentially, you know.
Right, because like I mean, everything is moving forward so fast still and changing every year to be something different, right?
Almost any book that you're gonna find that is talking about like the principles of game design or whatever, they don't even consider the existence of a live game, you know. I was literally reading one the other day where they were touting the coming of wow, oh, it's the same game and it stayed there for 5 years. You know, so in that sense it's I don't think there's anyone out there that has really like written up something that would work for a game that's alive and then you have to like adapt. Yeah,
because I mean, if you were gonna write a book, by the time it reaches publishing, it's like this feels 6 months out of date now.
Yeah, there is some of that, and there's also some hyper specificity about what it is to make a game that we're making sort of live, right? Like, I mean, I think things like the way that rufflecoptering changed into bullet jumping,
Oh yeah.
like there's just no way that anyone could have like even thought that that's a thing,
Yeah,
like
the through line was, I mean, I remember at the time the thought was, when are they going to remove this? Not when is this going to become and change into the
yeah,
new standard of Warframe, right?
yeah. And yeah, so those I think it's too new for books, but there are certain principles. And whenever I read, like for example, that book that I was just saying that I was just reading the other day that mentions WoW, they talk a lot about like the game design documents that they expect it to be like 100-page document with like the Bible and the thing that just doesn't exist anymore. Like it's just there's just there's no way that we could lock ourselves up to write a system document for a month and then come like no, by the time you come out it's totally useless, right? So
Mm.
it's way more dynamic now. It's yeah. It's interesting, but it is also tougher. Like honestly, sometimes I'm reviewing like reviewing tests and stuff like that for like game designers, and it's so tough to know like who's a good game designer
Oh
and stuff
yeah,
because
because I mean,
it's not
you can't know
subjective.
until you've worked with them for ages and it comes out and people like it or they don't, right?
Yeah, essentially like games, you never know. You never know.
Yeah, it's just extremely tough. Uh, so I don't know if this question is one that would be safe for a dev stream. I suspect that it would, so I'm not super expecting the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway because it was in some of Rebecca's recent interviews she did about Veilbreaker, which is upcoming. We know that there's going to be new content that's basically going to be a weekly sortie, as she described. Do you think that content is going to be hard enough to need a look back at other frames, or is that content positioned kind of similarly to sorties, where sorties I feel are very accessible?
They're not at the level of sorties. The problem is I didn't see her interviews. I don't know exactly what she said.
Oh, fair.
But I mean, I guess I could tell you just a little bit. Essentially, they are sorties, but more at steel path level.
Interesting.
Essentially, yeah. Essentially, at some point we said, "Oh, we want to do." Did she say the theme of them?
We just know
Yeah,
they're
it's
coming with
not.
Veilbreaker. There was no real
Okay.
theming. We know that they are involving the Archons, and the Archons are going
Okay.
to be
So
different week
yeah.
to week.
So at some point we had the idea of Narmer stories, and at some point we had the idea of Steel Path stories, and we just kind of did. Well, why not the same thing? And that's kind of so. Imagine that baby.
Yeah. Oh yes. And I mean, she mentioned that the kind of like Narmer Archon crystals are going to be some sort of new progression, or just that type of thing, like a longer term progression if it's going to be a weekly. What do you have any, I guess I usually it would be Sheldon from what we know publicly. It would seem like Sheldon is the kind of economy person. From a balance side, whenever you're looking at the new content and what it's releasing and the difficulty of it and such like that, is there a lot of co-op between what you're doing and who's designing like the rewards for that content? Or are those two things generally you find out what the rewards are going to be kind of later unless you balance them personally?
Yeah, generally you always keep in mind, okay, like this is the thing that we're putting so players can do, and then why are they doing it?
Right.
That's the classic. It is an extrinsic reward system that we sort of established. So you're not. We know that you wouldn't do the sortie just for the fun of it. You're gonna do it because you want another ribbon or you want to get a shot at the legendary core or something like that. So with that, definitely the rewards come pretty early in terms of like figuring out, okay, like how is this gonna work?
Hmm.
Um, in terms of generally, it's more like we know broad categories of what's gonna be there, and some of things will just fill in later. But in the case of something like this, where like she mentioned, there is a system, obviously that has to come pretty early because that system has to be coded and
Yeah, has to be coded, has to be
someone.
balanced, has to be tested, and
Yeah.
it goes very deep at that point, right?
Yeah. So, but it does depend. Like some of them we know that we're just gonna put stuff there that we kind of know exists. Some of them, in this case, is a little more specific to this new system.
Mhm. And then in terms of kind of spreading those rewards out, a lot of I feel this way. Obviously, you've seen the exact data on it, so feel free to tell me how it really is. But my view on certain reward structures for the game is that, say we want to get relics, right? There are a lot of areas of the game, say for Axie relics, that are very, very similar, and there tends towards being a lot of missions that, if they're the same type of mission, that reward pool is pretty much the same. Is there consideration for kind of changing up the star chart to make certain things more common in, say, Neptune has a better chance of these specific types of relics or these specific mods, as opposed to what we see now, which is an interception on Eris gives a split chamber, and the same can be said for the interception that's on Pluto. Like, they have the exact same kind of reward structure for a lot of missions. Is there, obviously, would be, depending on how the back end works, which I don't know, it could be a considerable amount of work. But is there interest in changing that up so there's kind of a specific zone for something, as opposed to the choice between the same drop table in a lot of areas?
So a bit of the push and pull on that. Like, for example, for resources, obviously we made it so it's per region, so that there's some motivation to go to specific places, and so it's easier to farm when you're early on in the game and stuff like that, right? So there is clearly, like, we see the benefits of that, particularly at that point.
Mm.
Later on, it becomes a little the other side of the coin. Later on, is players want to go play where they want to go play. So sometimes for that, it's better to just keep it a little more. So when you do the two different interceptions, you can go to either one. It's your choice where to go, and you'll basically have access to those rewards.
Mm.
And then there's the next consideration, which is more of a practical one. As you can imagine, whenever we're switching relics that we do for Prime Access or the Prime Bolt, it is a whole bunch of like pull from here, pull from there, put in here, like it's a lot of moving and pulling and shuffling things around.
Yeah. The old has to come out and the new has to come in.
Yeah, the more complicated we make it for us, the harder. It does get tough to keep those things straight with just so many different relics that we had to put in and out, and that generally, I mean, this is more of just like a practical thing for us. Generally, those updates need to happen in ways that they cannot fail, because obviously if they fail, we already have a lot of like structured releases for the consoles and stuff like that we just, they're kind of impossible to move. So
yeah, things just kind of have to work.
Yeah, okay. And you don't want to run into situations where like a frame comes out, like a new Prime comes out, but the relics are not available for a couple days, because then that feels pretty bad, right? So.
Yeah, because I mean, I think Warframe has been very known for the moment something is available, it's also, you can just go earn the thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's part of our DNA, and sometimes it's hard to achieve that, but we definitely try.
So do you think we might see a remix on rewards that are not relic related? Because we have a lot of the later star charts where it's 5K credits, and then that's the same as maybe Mars, which is a 5K credit reward on a defense tile, for example. Do you think there's any look at just the scaling of the kind of more generic rewards than the ones that, like relics, need to be replaced constantly, where we might see more rare mods available later in the chart and more of those early staples available early on in the chart?
I would say probably not, mainly because the how do you kind of get that motivation for the player? Increasing a mission from 5K to 10K is not gonna really make anyone want to do that mission. Generally, they'll want to clear the star chart because they haven't gone through those nodes, and then when they come back, it'll be because there's either a relic that they're going there to crack a relic, or they're going there because there's an arbitration, or because there's a daily syndicate. Those sorts of missions that kind of get players to play around in the star chart, and that they come with their own reward pools.
Okay.
So I don't really think like so actually I'm gonna like split the answer here a little bit. Is there a value to making sure some of the mandatory stuff is earlier on? Absolutely. Is there a value to putting rewards that will make it more worthy for you to come back and play Ares again? Probably not, because that Ares again, I'd rather you play that when there's a nightmare node that you want to complete, or there's you want to crack a relic, or you want to do something extra over there. That's one of our many rotating systems that kind of move you around.
Yeah.
But in terms of the base rewards, they become so negligible so fast that the scaling would have to we'd have to get kind of ridiculous with the numbers for someone like yourself to really care. Like, how many credits do I have to put in a mission in Ares for you to be interested in going?
Right. I
It's
mean,
probably
obviously,
gonna be
because
a
I have
crazy
access
number.
to like Profit Taker, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
So
Would
once
you say generally then you'd be more focused on the types of missions that are sort of well, like old alerts, where you have like your visors and just pushing people towards those types of missions more often, and those just generally seem to work better for Warframe at large?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where we are. People, since we have so many nodes, that if we made it really interesting for people to play any node, like at random, our matchmaking would get diluted into nothingness. Well, not really, because we fortunately our player base is so big that it actually can take it. But still, 120. Or well, I don't even know how many nodes we have, but however many nodes we have, if you divide the matchmaking by all of those, all of a sudden a lot of people are playing alone, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want that. So when you do a system, sort of like we do with all the relic stuff, or we do with arbitrations, or we do with ESO, or we do all of those kind of compact the matchmaking so that players end up playing with other people. So that is part of the virtue of those kind of systems, is that again they bring the steel pad missions are a great example. I remember before we added those, you would see, I would see it myself. I would go into a node to try and clear it because I'd never done it, and I'd be playing alone because there would be no one there.
Yeah, there's
because
just not enough people at that level yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the dailies for Steel Path really are, I mean, those are a great improvement to the Steel Path just in general. They have good rewards. Like, they kind of do everything that you said, which is just, you get the progress on the Steel Path, and also they're the things you want to do every day, right?
Yeah, and one of the biggest factors for us to want to introduce that was fix the dilution of the matchmaking. So, in that sense, those sorts of missions and things like bounties that bring people to want to do that one thing, help a lot with bringing players together to play.
Do you think so? I guess in terms of balance between getting players together and players playing together, do you have any insight into what you think the environment's going to be once we get to kind of cross play and cross save, where you have PC players playing with Xbox players? How do you think that's going to go whenever everyone's together?
Honestly, don't think it's gonna be too different, to be honest. Like, we don't, even in our smallest platform, there's not a lot of dead alerts, or where like you just kind of find anyone to play for the most part, because again of how our systems work, that since they people will gather around the latest content update, or they'll go around those sort of dailies or weeklies or whatever. Those kind of bring everyone together, so I don't think it's going to be too different. I think most of the benefits will be for maybe things like clans, for example. Those will be maybe a little more able to find people to play together, and also obviously anyone that's like I actually didn't really think too much. Like, whenever the crossplay obviously has been for a while, and it was always like, oh, it's cool. Sure, playing on different things sounds cool, but I don't think I'd ever do it. Then I started playing Genshin, and now I play like on mobile, and I play it on the PlayStation, and I play it on the PC. And I'm like, okay, no, you know what? Never mind. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, being able to log in anywhere has its charms, right?
Yeah, that one specifically is cross-save, which, as we say, that's a little later, but yeah, it does. It does definitely come with its charm.
And then I suppose it's kind of, this is kind of an out there question, I suppose. For the different frames, obviously you've worked on very many at this point. We talked about the first kind of one you got kind of major credit for was Nidus. Of the frames that you've worked on, is there one that like stands out to you as not necessarily your favorite to like play personally, but like was the most like rewarding to design?
Jared, as a designer, like I don't believe in perfect design. I always think there's trade-offs, and there's always like some things that will seem really good have their issues. So, for example, in the case of Nidus, probably not a lot of people would think this, but I think he has a very similar problem to Excalibur, which is, I think at some point you get really spammy with the one, and also the value of guns is low. I think those two frames share that problem, and I think if that problem was spread to all 49, the game would be in a lot of trouble. So it's kind of that feel. So then I think my second frame, if I remember correctly, was Harrow, where obviously I fixed the gun part.
Yeah, very much so.
The spam. I fixed the gun part, I fixed the spam, but it did create another problem. He was fairly complex. If you play, whenever I play Harrow, even myself, if I pick up Harrow right now, he does not feel like if I pick Wukong right now, and I play him, I'm gonna be, 2 hours from now, I'm gonna be like 10% better. But with Harrow, I feel like if I pick him up in 2 hours from now, I'm gonna be like 100% better, because the rhythm of how you use his abilities and kind of the cycles of what you need to be doing are harder to pick up and play than another one, but he can get really rewarding once you get good at him. Yeah. So, fix one problem, now I have a different problem. He's maybe too complex.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I remember our discussion from way back. I think it was the year Harrow came out. Was that 2018? I believe it was.
I'm very bad at years.
Yeah, it was the year Harrow came out. It was TennoCon, and I know we discussed about Harrow's 3 in terms of giving energy and whether or not teammates were going to be allowed to kind of proc that ability, and that went into you not wanting Harrow to be very just like activate that ability and then just hang out, which makes him a lot more active, obviously. Do you feel like Harrow, perhaps due to like his high complexity and his need to do a lot of things, that maybe the playstyle he wants sort of monopolizes the mission, even though he's a support? Or is it more so that you just want him to definitely always be doing things?
I don't think it does, because it's similar to the things since he relies so much on headshots. Like, headshots really kind of make his power exponential in a way. That leads to, and the fact that he doesn't have like AoE clearing or anything like that. I think people are still very much allowed to play when he's around. I don't think he hurts as much when people are around. I don't know if you saw on the I guess you have Harrow there. The fact that he's, once you adjust this for logarithm and you center, he's like almost dead center is. I think it's very, very suiting for a headshot frame.
Oh yeah.
That he's like almost dead center on the stats.
Is there?
But yeah, I do get what you mean in terms of like he has a bit of conflict when other people are clearing too fast. It can get hard for him to be good. But I think on the other end of things, like from a player that has a harrow, you for the most part all you're seeing is you're pretty healed all the time, you have energy all the time, and there's sometimes enemies that are perfectly paralyzed for you to headshot, right? So
Right.
I think as a player playing with him, it feels pretty good. As a player playing harrow, you can run into problems when there's a lot of AoE clearance for sure.
And then in terms of AoE clear, there is kind of one that I think Harrow, in my opinion, personally likes it very much. Do you think it's bad that Harrow can go for something like Thermal Sunder, which gives him the ability to have that AoE clear?
I don't think it's bad. I think it opens. I think it opens things, which in a way I think it's interesting.
Mm.
The thing that does happen, and this is more of the consequence of the internet. You know, sometimes some of those builds will become like the build just because. I think sometimes old people like myself can get nostalgic for the time where you could discover things.
Yeah, wow.
You know, uh, which obviously in today you cannot really quite do. Like I was playing a game called Nobody Saves the World.
Oh,
It's
that,
from
I also played quite a bit of that.
Yeah. So it's really cool. Basically, you'll have a whole bunch of different characters, that you can unlock, and each character has a bunch of abilities, but there are ability slots. So similar to Helminth, which is what made me think of that, you can switch which abilities you have on a character. You only have like one anchored ability, and the rest you can switch around. So as I was playing it, it was a lot of fun because you're like discovering these things, and you're like, oh, maybe if I use the witch with the zombie passive and the blah blah blah, and you start like mixing and matching them, and you can get that sort of discovery that can also exist in that also exists in a game like Warframe. But you can quickly see that if I kept playing that game beyond I don't know how many hours I played it, 30, 40 hours, however much I played it, if I played as much as Warframe 500 hours, I would have found forget all about that. You always use the egg with the zombie passive and the thing. I would have found the perfect answer.
Right.
And that's kind of what happens a little bit with Warframe. You can find the perfect answer a lot of the times, and then people will make videos of it and just.
And then whenever that kind of perfect answer exists, does it matter more how perfect it is? Because like in the case like we've seen with Wukong seems to be a little too perfect for too much of the content, as opposed to something like Harrow, Thermal Sunder, with where Harrow is here, doesn't really seem to be a problem at all.
I think like a good example is Ibarra, right? Like she's a perfect answer for spies, and I'm totally fine with that. Like I'm not I don't think that's a problem. I think it kind of depends on what question they're answering. If something becomes a perfect answer for everything, that is a problem, because then there is no space for the rest of the game, right? And so that is a problem. So that is kind of how I think about it. If some item is displacing too many other things, then it's problematic.
Right.
If that makes sense. But I'm totally okay if like I remember when we were developing Angels of Saruman, and I always call this the wrong name. Armageddon, is that the one with the angels?
Armageddon is the one that has the waves of angels.
Okay. Can't remember what it is. I think I used to call it Extinction all the time.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it had 6 different dev names, right?
It also had that, yeah. So in that one, I remember one time I was testing the sorties. This is before it was released, and the sortie was you couldn't lose. I think you couldn't lose any tower. It was something like that. That was like very hard to do, especially because I was testing solo. So it was like the max level bounty, and I think it was that you cannot lose any tower, something like that. Because you have those things that you have to defend. from the angels. And I was like, I tried it, I remember, with a couple of frames, and I was like, this is impossible. I cannot do it solo.
Yeah.
And then once I was going to give up, I was like, wait, but there's Frost. And then I just put on Frost, and it was very easy to. That was the answer. There was literally a question and an answer. That was the right answer. And I think it's cool when you can find that answer as a player, where you can feel like it's fine for you to feel like you outsmarted the game. That is a good feeling, and that is something that we do want to find opportunities for you to do. It only becomes problematic when the same answer works for any question, because then you're not asking yourself anything anymore, because you have the answer for everything.
Right.
So that's kind of how I think about it.
So for the question and answer, which is definitely, like, I think I've described often that Warframe is sort of an arsenal game. It's very toolboxy, where each thing is for something in a lot of cases. Is there a baseline that you want to look at for any given frame where they need to do at least this much of the content at like a certain level before they're at a level where you want them? Or is it more, if they have a specific job, that's enough and they don't need to meet a particular baseline?
I don't really think of them as that. Like the top priority for me when making a new frame is that it feels different when you're playing it. That is like my highest priority. Is that when you're doing the moment to moment gameplay, it just feels different to move around and to which buttons am I pressing, what am I doing. That is like the most important. It might sound a little absurd, but for example, Chroma and non-augment version of Mirage, for example, are very similar. It's like two buffs that you just keep up, right? And then you just shoot things, right? So even though they're very different frames, like, they obviously have different amounts of resistance and stuff. They both have, essentially, if you don't have the augments on, they both have two abilities that you ignore, and then two abilities that you cast every 30-40 seconds, right? And then you just shoot things. So that is always the main thing I'm like thinking when as I'm running around and I'm doing things. I'm feeling the frame, and I'm saying, like, does this feel the same as something else?
Right.
If it feels like I'm playing Bolt but I'm playing a different frame, then that's a problem, and those are kind of the things that I'm always kind of in the lookout for. That is my top priority. Then generally my priority is finding something that you can say, oh, that's different on them, right? So I want you, like, when you see a frame, I want you to say, oh, like, oh, that's a frame with a turret, or oh, that's a frame that can that their abilities can crit, or oh, that's a frame with a K drive. I want you to have like what is it that this frame is, that is what is kind of different about them.
Yeah, they're kind of clear feel.
Yeah, like there's some identity there, that is kind of theirs. And then that combined with feeling different are my top priorities. Then after that, I'll take them to missions just to make sure that they can stand a certain amount of content, at different levels of modding. But I can't think of, like, there's a few examples where I have thought of, like, well, this will work really well on mission X, right? And I'll keep it just because I really like that. But I would never come to a frame thinking like, okay, this is gonna be the mobile defense frame. I would never come at it from that angle, because I'm not looking for you to like feel like this frame is only good for this content. And I know that might sound a little counterintuitive with what I said earlier for Ibarra, for example, where she excels at that one particular place. But like, I don't think she was made for that. It's more like, that just in the natural min-maxing of Warframe, that just kind of happens. You know?
And I would say specifically for Ivara, I think her augment sort of is what gives her that job. Do you think that in general, augment design leans towards giving a Warframe a new job in a lot of cases, where it's like, well, we're going to give them this augment because it will be either, a very interesting, just a different thing for them to do, or it will make them good at this content, and we want them to be good at this?
I wouldn't say there's always like a recipe approach for how those come to be. Sometimes it's just you'll be like some wacky idea that I had, and I was like, oh, that'd be kind of cool. Sometimes it will be like, okay, I need an augment for this frame. What are they bad at? Like I'll look at some of those and be like, okay, well, what could they benefit from on an augment, or I'll try their abilities and be like, it'd be kind of funny if this had X twist, so it does depend there. Obviously, in the case of a barrel, like the particular augment, the infiltrator, that very much leans towards kind of in the opposite direction, which is instead of the what are they bad at, that one just kind of leaned on more like, okay, what is the identity of the frame and what can they do that would be special, that wouldn't be already kind of captured by something else in a frame.
Right.
I would not. I don't. I can't think off the top of my head of one where it was like, oh, I'm gonna give this augment so that people can put it when they go and do survival. Because for the most part, that changing. I wouldn't want you to be switching builds all the time between every mission. I do want it to feel more optional. Like, oh, if I really want to min-max in this mission, maybe I'll go change things. But other than that, I wouldn't want you to be like in between a mission, just stop, go to the arsenal, switch one mod, and then come back. Like, it just doesn't feel like it feels like too much.
Yeah. So in that exact vein, actually, right now, just mathematically optimally, you have the like primed bane mods of all their different varieties, and those in weapons are generally going to be the best thing that you can be using. But obviously, you do have to do that, go back every time and change it. And I feel like for that reason, those mods don't get used very much. Is there any interest in kind of removing the need for banes to constantly go back and maybe adjust those so that there isn't the constant switching?
Well, actually, more like in the other direction, which would be like we have so many weapons that I would like to have some that feel more specialized towards corpus, so that you have a weapon along with its mod build and along with its arcane that you think, okay, this is the corpus killer or whatever. The practical reality of the game as it stands right now is that anything that can kill Grenier can kill anything else. So as long as you got something that's good enough to kill Grenier, even though the elemental damages are not optimal for anything else, you'll be fine. You'll be fine just because it's an overwhelming force. So that is kind of the where you fall there. Now, for some people that are looking for like the squeeze every amount of damage, I think the Bane mods, that's a place they have. I definitely agree that they're underused. I think it comes from two sides. I think one is they don't communicate well why they do. Because as a player that hasn't read the math or hasn't read the wiki, you look at 55% damage, but I have this other one that says 165%. So this one's terrible, right? And there is that sort of thing where just like the math of how things work just makes it complicated for you to really understand how the game works and what these mods can do for you. So that's one side for players that are kind of early on. They're not going to adopt those mods until they find out about that information. 15 mastery ranks later. And by the time they found out, they'll see, okay, well, if I put this, I can do 20% more damage than if I don't put it on. But at the same time, I'm already overkilling things by 5x, so I don't really that bother of going back to switch it is just not worth it. So that's kind of how those, I think, kind of falter.
Interesting. Do you think with the kind of difficulty of learning like those mods not being clear exactly what they do, we haven't gotten to the point where the mod UI has like received the refresh that much of the game has seen, do you think there is a chance that we might see a refresh on that UI, surface some of the damage formula to be more clear what exactly the mods are doing? Or is that maybe a little in too deep and would scare away players, do you think?
So if you watch that no clip documentary, I think Steve tells the anecdote there of showing the game to a friend of his, and the friend basically says that he like alt F4 the second he saw the mod screen.
Yeah, the kill screen of the mod screen.
Yeah, mods is it's a screen that we've actually literally hired external teams and stuff to work on to try and find ways to simplify it. But it's very hard. It's one of those there's the meme of we'll fix it in UI. Do you know that that's what you do? And sometimes when you're game designing, like if you have something that's really complicated, you just we'll fix it in UI, and that's kind of how you'll figure out how to make the game design understandable at that point. But in some cases, it's just unrealistic. Like sometimes the complexity of how things actually work is just too much for a UI to not become essentially a spreadsheet of sorts. Right. I would say that at this point, for like a player that's trying to learn the game, there's much more basic stuff that is hard to understand, like the combining of the elements and stuff like that, without even getting into those more like when does it multiply, how exactly does the math work, and so. Do we want, we've been redoing all those screens, and it doesn't take a lot to see which ones we haven't changed. We haven't changed the hard ones.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a really, really hard problem, right? I mean, you want to get it right so you don't have to do it again later.
We've done it a few times already. So, those, like literally, we have graveyards of mocks for those screens, trying to find a way to make them better. And sometimes like there is a loss when you just change things for marginal gain. So you will lose the familiarity. So even if we can find some ways to make it 20% better, the loss of familiarity is a bigger hit, right? So we need to find kind of like something that makes them considerably better, and we haven't really. That is the reality. If you watch me in a few of the dev streams, I often say, and now we're changing this to surface. Surface is like my, if I were to write my Pablo's 5 rules of design, one of them would be that if the player cannot see it, it didn't happen. That's generally how I put it. And you can see some of that with the changes to the Eximus. You can see some of that with the changes to the Noxus, for example. The Noxus even had some damage reduction I didn't even know about.
I mean, after enough years, something that just get lost. Like, it wasn't until at some point, I think it was Glenn was doing a stream where he was optimizing the game, and we found out Nova had damage reduction on her 1.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of things like that to me are like. And I think this is part of like my background of coming from UI. I do have a lot of that sort of like gotta show things so that the players understand it. So we definitely it's an ongoing effort to surface things and to make them a little clearer of like, okay, what exactly is happening here, and why does this work the way it does, and which a lot of it comes from consistency passes, or making consolidation of features. In the case of Overguard, once you understand Overguard, it was easy. Well, it wasn't easy, but it was clear to me at that point that I needed to use it for the ancient healers and for the Noxus, because I could make, as long as you understood what Overguard was, now you understood those 2 units without having to know. Because as a new player, how would you know that the ancient healer was giving AoE, CC protection to every unit around it? There was no way to know before, and I'm sure you experienced this a lot playing, because I know I did, where you would see an enemy and you'd be like, why is he not ragdolling?
Right.
And then you look around and they'd be like an ancient healer over there, and you're like, just you.
This guy.
So now you see the little protection thing on a unit that generally doesn't have it, and you go, oh, there's an ancient healer somewhere here, right? So it allows you to grok those sorts of mechanics, and as long as a player figures out what overguard is, then now they understand more things in the game. And that's kind of my general approach for those things, is like to try and like bring things together.
Just bring things in front. So for the modding in that case, do you think that there would be some value in having, say, like the first 3 planets, for example? You get, out of the tutorial, you're on Earth. Do you think there's some value in, instead of having the modding system just straight up accessible right away to players, if there was more of a like kind of mini quests, I suppose, in order to get some mods that you just automatically get installed, and then you don't have to do it yourself. It's just you're stronger because we've given you this, but later you will get access to doing it yourself, which can be more intimidating that early.
I don't want to get into super specifics, because we have been talking about things like that we do want to do at some point next year. But we have many different versions of where we think we could take it, and some have pros and cons. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, no design is perfect. They all have like a little bit of drawbacks in certain parts. Some will be like they delay how when you start to learn about this important system, or some will be like they remove some of the loot chases. There's a lot of things there, but it is definitely something that is in my mind for us, and generally in the mind of the team to kind of make better. We are clear that that modding is a point where players drop off, and we're also clear that the early power level of players is very constrained by things like damage mods and things like that. So we are clear that there are problems there to be solved.
Interesting. Okay, so we have been talking for like 2 hours or so, and I don't want to just keep you all night, as much as that would be extremely interesting. So last question. You've mentioned that Mirage and Chroma play very similarly, and that's something that you generally dislike. Would you say that frames like that, or are there any frames that you are much more interested in reworking just because you feel like they don't fit into that mold of being different enough from their other frames around them?
Well, the asterisk I would put is that Mirage can get a much more fun build by putting an augment. So she does have alternative builds, but Chroma doesn't.
Right.
Chroma is pretty stuck. Would I, if in an ideal world where I was free to do what I wanted, would I change Chroma? Would I change the arrows, for example? Yes, like I would, because I do feel like those they feel a little flat in their gameplay. They don't have a lot going on that is interesting. They're not, kind of how earlier I was talking about Nidus and some of the decisions that you make when you see a crowd, when you blah blah blah. So there's like see thing, react to thing. There's not a lot of reaction to be done with something like Chroma or in arrows. So I would like to, but it wasn't like, honestly, like I think I read a comment not like more than 2 months ago, complaining about the fact that I changed the Phi on Wukong. So people hold on to those sorts of things. So if I change Chroma, I couldn't leave Chroma as the one-shot frame that he kind of is right now. Like the buff all the damage to 900% or whatever is his cap right now, and then just do buku damage for a little bit. It's not the funnest thing, but there are some people that really like doing that.
Right.
So it is touchy to go and change it. So that is kind of the where I kind of roll back to what I said earlier, which is like, what do I get out of it? Because I know I'm gonna get a lot of angry posts if I nerf how much single target damage he does, even if I give him a whole bunch of other things. I know that one I'm gonna be getting complaints about that for another 4 years. So what do I get out of it?
People will just stick to it and be like, man, that thing you changed.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what I like. What does, for example, Inaros do really well? He never dies, right? That's what he does really well. Is that a lot of fun? I wouldn't say so. So yeah, that is kind of the what did Wukong used to do very well. He never died, right? That's essentially what he used to do. Now at least you have to like keep your tree up. You know, use your tool every now and then if you're about to die.
Yep,
And
get some healing in there.
You still have some get out of free jail cards, but you know they're there to kind of help you, but they run out eventually.
Yeah, eventually you don't have any more.
Yeah, so with Inaros you never die. With Wukong it's hard to die, but you can do it if you make an effort.
Yeah, you can get there.
Yeah, so changing those sorts of things require a give and take that is troublesome to do PR wise. Like imagine if I give a lot of like AoE clearing to a frame like Inaros, and all of a sudden now he's unkillable, but he also can like clear the map, right? So like you know,
now we can do both.
Yeah, so obviously I cannot just do that. So there has to be a little bit of give and take, and then that take can be draining PR wise, essentially.
That's fair.
In terms of the relationship with the community, you know.
Mm-hmm. And so I mean, it's always the balance of you wanna make the most people happy while doing the changes that you want to make, right?
Right. That I think are, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, like when you're designing something, you only have the judgment you have, right? So
yeah.
I only have the taste I have, and you know, while I'm making some changes, I will think of like, what do I think is right here? Do I think it's right for a frame to be unkillable and at the same time be able to do a whole bunch of other stuff? Probably not. So I would have to like, and then it becomes like a little touchy.
Yeah. Well, and then as Chad is mentioning before we wrap up, they would very much love to know just your general thoughts on the kind of progression we saw with Dissipate, with where it released and where it is now. Do you think it's in a good place, and what were the issues with it that caused it to get nerfed? Obviously, always feel free to not answer.
Yeah, honestly, that one's a little tough because, well, I was definitely involved in the decisions of how it started and the decisions of how it changed, but also, you know, even though that was like 2 months ago, to me it feels like 2 years ago. The amount of things that I've looked at since it's a little. So I
mean, you're worrying about things that are coming out a year from now we haven't even heard of yet.
Yeah, that is, and it's a lot of stuff that I don't really remember any like the specifics of where it is, and also when we changed it, you know, that's basically when we had to really ramp up the crazes for Tenocon. So I don't actually. It's been a moment since I've reviewed where it is and what it needs. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier, like our attention kind of comes and goes, and we have to look at different things.
Yeah.
At some point my eye will come back to focus and will be like, okay, well, it's been several months of people using focus. How are they feeling about the notes? Are there any that need changing? You know, that kind of thing. We generally do like an immediate reaction 2-3 weeks after, just to do those changes, and then we kind of have to let it sit for a few months while we do the other stuff, and eventually the cycle will come back around, and then we'll look at all that stuff again.
And I mean, especially, of course, it never helps whenever it comes at the busiest time of the year, I'm sure, with TennoCon.
Right. You know, that obviously combined with it wasn't any TennoCon.
Well, you know, it was a very big TennoCon.
Yeah.
And then I'm fairly certain I know this. You are now in the position that Scott was in, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations, first and foremost. That is very big, and I think it would speak for most of the community that it feels like that just makes sense.
Well,
Like
I'm glad.
just given, you know, the way you kind of, you know, I think you've been a very public figure along with the rest of the people with Warframe that we've known since the very beginning. Obviously, you came in a bit later in terms of being very public, but I think it's been, you know, very, very much whenever it was announced that Rebecca was creative director and like other things were moving, it's like, well, obviously we know what Pablo's doing now.
Well, here we are. Here's for another 10 years, hopefully.
Oh yeah, no, I would very much into it as someone who's who's in the position I'm in, right?
Yeah, no, it's been great. I mean, honestly, like it's been pretty refreshing to kind of like try new things and just get like into a new sort of dynamic.
Was there any whenever obviously I assume much like Rebecca where she said she's been kind of, you know, working into the position over a larger amount of time. Whenever you kind of grabbed the reins, was there any big like this is the first change I'm making? Now that I can just get one in there, this is the one change. This is the one I have to do.
Not really, to be honest. I mean, we've been at it for several months, but also like I've had like a lot of input for a long time. So if it's something I want to make and it isn't in the game, it's probably because I know of a reason why. It's never been like there isn't a thing in the game that I want and is not there for unreasonable reasons. It's all because of like, well, we don't have the people to do it right now, or we don't,
Right.
or it would be conflicting with this or that. So yeah, for the most part, like we've always been. We've always had a lot of freedom to just kind of add what we believe is good for the game within the resources that we have, of course.
Yeah, which I mean, considering the things that have been added to Warframe, they get pretty big. What with, I mean, we've seen, Railjack and Liches and all the open worlds and things coming around, and obviously Duviri and Veilbreaker to come seem like they're also quite ambitious. So there's always a huge project seemingly always on the horizon, right?
Yeah, and we're always excited to try new things. Obviously, something like Saruman, we hadn't done a new game mode since 2019. We did 3 in one go. And the tile set we did it quite differently than other ones. A lot of emphasis in exploration, which we never really done before. Lots of little like extra tidbits here and there on the tile set to make it so that be it getting the buffs, finding the plumes, like they're finding the little ghost kits. A lot of those things have been very much about like being able to explore new ideas and kind of look around.
Do you think we'll continue to see more of that stuff? Because from my perspective personally, having the tile sets have those extra objectives, even looking at just at exterminate, having the plumes in there and the angels that spawn in and all of those bonus objectives really adds a lot more to it than just it's exterminate, but it looks different. Do you think we're going to see more interesting mechanics like the ones that we have in the Zaramon going forward?
Well, Rev and me were pretty obsessive about those sorts of things and adding them. And if we kept going, we would have kept on adding more. So yeah, I think that's essentially that I think Saruman gives you a pretty good feel for the things that we like and that we gravitate towards, in particular in terms of like trying things. I would say that that's the main thing. And obviously not everything's gonna be a home run immediately, but some hopefully they'll work. And yeah, hopefully there are things that players enjoy. And similarly to how I was saying earlier, that playing a different frame should feel different. Ideally, playing in a different task in a different mission also feels considerably different, and you don't feel like doing a mobile defense on Saruman feels the same as a mobile defense on Ares, where I do think that right now some of the older tasks it can feel like that. So.
Well, it has been absolutely phenomenal having you. Thank you for just, I just sent you a message on Twitter and you were like, absolutely, let's do it. We got it together really quickly, and you've been super candid, and it's been a fantastically, just large amount of just insight into the way that you look at the game and how things are designed and the recent going ons. I feel like it's you know, just it's always very nice, and it's the way D has been, which is the very open with information and everything, and we really appreciate it.
Ranting about design is always something I'm always available to rant about design.
If you want to rant about any topic, I will absolutely rant right back to you. If you start looking at a frame and you're like, this frame, we got to talk about this frame, hit me up at any point. More than happy to do so.
It's a pleasure hanging out with you and your community.
Thank you.
Goodbye to everyone. We'll
Also,
hope you
thank you everyone in chat for behaving.
Honestly, if I'm being 100% honest, I did not actually look at chat, but
No, that's valid.
Yeah.
I mean, you were giving us. I mean, we were. You know, you have to go. You're deep in the tank with like the insight into all the different facets of what we were talking about. It's, you know, a fairly deep conversation.
Yeah, honestly, these sorts of things are like the things I think about often. They're interesting and intricate to how the game works, and you know, the kind of the legacy of 10 years, but also like the foundation for the next 10 to come.
Yeah. And then just right at the end here, I want to remind everyone in chat that obviously Pablo is just one member of the big team that is DE. Anything that was talked about here is not like a promise that X, Y, and Z is going to happen. It doesn't mean that Chroma's in the works for a rework or anything like that. This is not the place where that type of thing would be announced.
Yeah, I hope I didn't promise anything. If I did, well, that's my bad.
Yeah, no, I think we did a pretty good job of, like, you know, it's more about the theory and like the way things are thought about, as opposed to exactly what's coming up, which is the information we get on like dev streams and more official type channels, I suppose.
Yeah, and the next dev stream, which has been announced already, a lot of if you want details specifically for what Veilbreaker is and some of the changes that are going to come to frames and stuff like that, they'll be there. Quite a few things that you guys don't know about yet. I'm pretty excited about the Veilbreaker out there, because obviously it's kind of rare for us, but we have this update which has a lot of stuff, but you know, in TechnoCon it was like a 1.5-minute trailer, and that was it, and moving on to all of the other things we had to announce. So yeah, we have quite a few things to cover in the next dev stream, so be sure to check it out.
I'm sure we are all looking forward to it, and obviously, if we get that information about Veilbreaker and we have all that stuff out there, and you would like to wax poetic once again, you are more than welcome to join me after that. But yeah,
let's see how it goes for this one. If I didn't say something I shouldn't.
Oh no. But yeah, it has been fantastic having you, Pablo. Thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, obviously check out the dev stream and all the other informations for official news. But that's some really good insight into what we can, you know, expect in terms of the design philosophies going forward and the interesting things that we've seen even so far.
Yep.
But yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks
Later,
for hanging
everybody.
Out. Adios.
I will be editing this video, and then there will be a stream later. But yeah. Later, everybody. Oh, thank you for joining me. Sorry, I had to mute myself down the stream. They can hear me right now. One sec. It's okay. Later, Pablo.